All right, hello and welcome to the March SERI webinar. Before we get to our presenters, I just want to remind you that the SERI webinars continue into June. On April 13th, we have Wrapping Up RATOM, a summary and lessons learned from the Review, Appraisal, and Triage of Mail project with Camille Tyndall-Watson, Cal Lee, and Cam Woods. On May 11th, Building a National Finding Aid Network Update will be presented by Adrian Turner. And June's webinar will focus on building your resume for the digital age. As always, we welcome you to contribute or visit the Resource Center available on the COSA website. There's information on digital preservation, along with recordings of past webinars on a range of topics, such as making the elevator pitch for electronic records. All right. Our speakers today are Suzanne Stasiulatis from the Pennsylvania State Archives. Suzanne has over 10 years of experience in archives and records management and has worked for the Pennsylvania State Archives for the past 8 years. In addition to assisting with the electronic records management system, Digital Archives, Digital Record Center planning, migration, and technology duties, she currently works on the preservation of digital accessions that seem to be coming into the archives increasingly frequently. She holds 2 bachelor's degrees and a Master of Arts, maintains a Society of American Archivists Digital Archive Specialist certification, and has completed coursework through the Association for Information and Image Management. She is a huge proponent of continuing education and takes free classes through Coursera, W3 Schools, and the like on topics ranging from Python to user experience design. Our second speaker is Jamie Patrick Burns. Jamie is the digital archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina, where she is responsible for the day-to-day operations and maintenance of the repository of born digital and digitized records. She has been with the State Archives since 2017. Previously, she worked for Durham County Library and WiderNet, a nonprofit that works to improve digital communications and bridge the digital divide. And our final speaker is Brian Thomas. Brian was an insurance injury claims adjuster before starting his second career as an electronic records archivist at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, where he, along with Brian Colliers, was responsible for the testing and selection of the platform for the South Carolina Electronic Records Archive. In late 2015, Brian transferred to the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, where he is one of 2 electronic records specialists managing the Texas Digital Archive. His work time fun is spent figuring out how to innovate and make the computers do the heavy lifting through programming in Python. We ask that all questions be held until the end, but please feel free to enter questions into the chat box at any time during the webinar. And I will now turn it over to Susan from Pennsylvania.
Hello. Thanks for reviewing the presentation. I'd like to thank Texas and North Carolina for also having representatives. Both those states have aided in our efforts on a number of times on a number of fronts, and we are very thankful. I'm a digital archivist with the state of Pennsylvania. I'm generally used in various divisions for insight, but most recently, I have transferred to the Record Services Division and hope to work heavily with our Digital Record Center once procurement is complete. Although I don't have an IT academic institution background, I'm a huge proponent of self-teaching. I'm an example that anyone can learn digital skills in today's world. The amount of digital preservation resources on the web is astounding. As Barbara said, I make use of W3 Schools and Coursera training on a regular basis. Pennsylvania is procuring a digital preservation system. We do not endorse any one program or system at this time. This presentation is my perspective and my take on tool implementation and the procurement project management steps. Our sites have been set on a digital preservation system since 2016, even 2015. There's been a lot of obstacles along the way, and although timetables adjust, I like to think of our goal, as some others do, as new building, new preservation system. That's our other major effort at this time. The opening date fluctuates, but construction is happening even while archivists are working from home. We are centering our approach on an integrated digital archives and digital records center, and we're calling this the DADRC, or the DADREC. We are very interested to hear and share ideas with other institutions, specifically those looking at digital record centers. I'd like to focus first on our initial efforts to implement easy-to-use tools that fit basic needs for our growing digital acquisitions from state agencies. These tools are instrumental in helping us complete necessary tasks and assist in functions that would otherwise be tedious or cumbersome, like file renaming. Digital challenges are meeting us every day, and despite not having a powerful preservation system, when we look at digital files, we recognize that bits and bytes are totally different from pieces of paper. Integrity issues, renderability, persistence hurdles. Our ability to transfer records continues, even though it's not as simple as moving box A from here to there. We are working to recognize obsolescence and bit rot as major obstacles, but we're hoping a digital preservation system can address these things comprehensively. In the interim, we are testing and implementing tools ad hoc. These tools help with conversion, deduping, file renaming, transcription, email, and similar things. While we test a lot of tools, they are not always implemented. Evaluation can stop at any point along the way for a number of reasons. First, we begin with assessment. Input from other states is very important to us. We often pose questions to our colleagues in other states. Their experiences and similar missions, goals, and roadblocks are invaluable to our analysis. In addition, shameless plug, we check the Coastal Resource Center, sites like Copter, and solicit the larger preservation community as well. We test tools prior to implementation. We're lucky enough to have a virtual machine to help us test before we fully commit to a tool. That gives us a virtual space with admin rights to use tools that otherwise would not be available without a lengthy process. It's best to keep current with whatever's going on, explore, watch webinars, and learn from others. Basic ideas like OAIS persist, and in my opinion, it's best to ground everything in those ideas. In terms of our implementation process for something like file renaming, we follow basic steps. The process is fairly simple. The file renaming program we had didn't fit our needs, so we surveyed websites and programs at a high level, and then chose several that met basic needs, so like file renamer, bulk rename utility, and we looked at those more carefully. We analyzed the administrative considerations and critical features via a spreadsheet. Considerations such as cost or home country were of interest to management, while features stated on the website included things like the ability to use regec expressions or find hidden files. I obtained buy-in from management to test those programs, and I downloaded to the virtual machine and tested the programs. Our IT department set up this virtual space, and it's invaluable, so we document and track everything we do. Back. I conferred with staff about their needs and evaluated the programs, and then one program was chosen and piloted. We surveyed the staff about their user experience and developed a workflow together. After full buy-in, we downloaded the program for all the staff that required the file renaming functionality. It is very important for us to complete matrices for tools and to compare features prior to download on our virtual machine. And in that way, we can evaluate high-level characteristics and features shown on websites, manuals, or demos. These matrices allow us to justify tools for administrators and provide documentation of analysis for discussion. Testing is extremely important and follows our tool comparison analysis. We have a file format folder which contains a variety of formats that were developed or adapted based on our current holdings. I have used them in multiple instances. We also test things like hidden files and read-only files and special sets of digital files particular to our institution. We test things like file path lengths, file name lengths, in order to try to exceed limits. We did at one point, we tried to break things, and it was a little bit of a joke, but that's not always necessary, but testing limits most certainly is. We go through testing things like speed and size to ensure programs function within our expectations. Patron staff and everyone involved can all at one time or another be caught waiting for something to finish running. So efficiency is very important to our institution. Testing can be complex. Several years ago, we preliminarily tested several digital preservation systems, and the testing was much more robust for those systems. Once testing is complete, we have full buy-in. We develop workflows and implement. Workflows, like any other step, require a survey of the community and evaluation. There are currently a lot of tools out in the world about creating workflows, so I won't go too heavily into that today. In the past, we built workflows to suit our current needs before, during, and after implementation, and of course, we tweak those workflows regularly. At implementation, we usually, everyone needs support tools. So, Excel is your friend. I personally love XML conversion tools, so they seem to come in quite handy. Again, this was our process for temporary solutions. Procurement for the Digital Archives Digital Record Center is proving to be a time-consuming process. I'll always ask what we can do now. At present, we store our sessions in baguette bags ready for processing when we're able. Still, we have issues with the low cost, sometimes rudimentary tools we use. My job often involves creative problem solving. Things like video files or bagger profile changes, VPN issues, they all present unique and confounding issues. At the same time, the interoperability of the baguette specification makes it likely that migration will be smooth and standard. In the past, we have opted for trial versions and demos. It's a great way to allow for training and get up to speed on current practices. It encourages dialogue within an organization and is the best way to get a feel for things. It often proves to sway people one way or another. I mentioned that we use a virtual machine set up by our IT department. If that's an option for you, great. It really helps to have admin access when needed. It's something that we wouldn't normally get, but as we consider ourselves IT-focused professionals, it's really necessary to do our job. So trial versions are available for most tools and some preservation systems, and it's always nice to find a tool that has a demo on their website. You really only need 30 days or so for a tool evaluation. Take advantage of the demos for more complex systems, but be careful to ensure you test to make sure the features meet your specific needs and are demonstratable by staff. Good marketing does not always mean a good solution. We found a useful exercise to review trusted digital repository and trustworthy repositories audit and certification criteria and checklist requirements, and to redline, highlight, debate the relevance of those features to our organization. We must have gone through this exercise once every year or so in our procurement journey. It's a great way to consider what is possible and not possible for your institution, and shows today what you'll need for tomorrow and what can be improved upon. For us, for Pennsylvania, the project management process meant understanding our purpose and need and hiring a project manager. We have to cooperate with our centralized IT department in a joint effort. We have a defined process for procurement, and the entire process involves staff support and input. In the planning phase, the PM identified stakeholders and assigned responsibility via a RACI chart. He documented the notional to-be processes, which are just the basically described processes that we want to have based on what we do have, or the as-is. This process involves surveying the staff about the as-is, what they currently do, and beg the question of how things could be done better. Functional requirements were developed based on staff input and comments. This is where the TDR, track guidance, technical expertise of staff, and the organizational knowledge and needs came into play. We refined those requirements and finalized them after staff reviewed and provided comments. The PM then takes these comments and molds the requirements to satisfy all the parties that are involved. The solution selection and procurement portion of the process will be to produce an RFP and solicit vendors for response. We will evaluate the vendor response and may request project demonstrations as needed. From those factors, we will select the most appropriate solution. Of course, the procurement contracts follow Pennsylvania specific regulations. The demos, in my opinion, are important because they lay a base for understanding and allows for discussion about how training and the building process will go from the ground up. It allows for a bridge for terminology and like-minded thinking. It also opens the door to ask about what customizations are available and, of course, the dreaded question of cost. When we get to it, we will need to configure and develop the preservation workflow. This will require establishing corresponding processes, workflows, and policies, including processes for migrating existing digital objects from disparate storage locations into the solution, and for chargeback mechanisms to support the shared services funding stream. In a nutshell, we have different types of assets and collections, and they have unique needs. From microfilm scans to access copies of digital images, large source video files, and we also have sessions waiting for processing. We're hoping that a unified system will allow us to work with this digital material in a variety of forms that is managed or monitored by staff in different areas of our archives. At the same time, we need to make sure we have a budget for incoming sessions that will likely come in full force once the DRC is up and running. That's the Digital Records Center. This is a huge multifaceted project. The Digital Archives and Digital Records Center, DRC, will involve everyone in the archives and the agencies that support Pennsylvania. We'll need to fully test functionality, workflows, and processes and produce user documentation. Our final milestones are training and knowledge transfer. Right now, we're on track. So as far as schedule, our project manager makes weekly updates, and I'm excited for the solution selection and procurement phase. Everything's going very smoothly. And this is my contact information. Feel free to contact you. As I've said before, I like to ask questions and continue conversations. So if you're specifically looking for a digital record center, of course, I have questions for you, but I'd love to start a conversation. So thanks for viewing, and I think Jamie is next.
So I will be talking about the process of selecting a digital preservation platform in North Carolina. Here we go. For the state of North Carolina, digital preservation is a joint effort between the state archives and the state library. We have distinct but related collecting mandates, and we've developed our digital preservation guidelines together. We work closely on things like storage management and subscriptions and systems. And our digital repository includes state agency records, state publications, and special collections materials. This is a little snapshot of our digital access portal for digital collections, which kind of discusses distinct from our actual preservation system, but it's a good little visual of some of what we have for digitized and for digital records. So in the process of building a repository in 2014, the state archives and state library started testing and selecting a system to bring together the storage, tools, and services and workflows that we have chained together in-house. And by we in this presentation, I mean the royal we, or the institutional we. as there's been, it's been a process of several years with staff turnover involved. So I'm talking about institutional memory as well as mine. So I will share our experiences with testing and evaluating 3 systems and kind of the lessons on evaluation that we learned through each one, as well as some overall thoughts and recommendations. There's obviously no one right way to do it or one kind of system that works for everyone, but hopefully this is helpful to share some of our experience. So let's see, for the first system that we tested, it began in November of 2014. We already had a document of repository requirements. So that was turned into a spreadsheet of features to test, grouped into 7 different categories: security, free ingest, intellectual control or cataloging, active preservation, access, and an exit strategy. And I think there were 60-ish different criteria that were grouped under those categories. And each feature was given a weight based on how important it was determined to be, and then scored on a scale. So from that first round of system evaluation, there was a good foundation of evaluating a preservation platform against our requirements. You know, a lot of what Suzanne was talking about as far as stakeholders and kind of knowing your audience and getting that information on what you require for your institution. Staff took notes and produced a report, and those 7 categories to group the different functionalities was really helpful. However, when it came time to test the next system, there were some challenges. The first was staff turnover. There was some loss of knowledge in between the rounds of testing, as far as, you know, what test data sets they used and why things were scored the way they were. It ended up being somewhat subjective on that scale and just not easy to compare the results across systems, and not easy to reproduce. So for the next round, in 2015, the state library received a grant to test another digital preservation platform. Half of the testing team was new hires, which was a challenge, but also a chance to kind of revisit that original spreadsheet of requirements. And so the team this time around determined that was a thorough document, but was based on kind of pie in the sky, every feature they would like to have, and not narrowed in on digital preservation only. And so, for example, there were some pieces about the access system and integration with our current catalog that are nice, but not really core digital preservation functionalities. So also some of the staff had software development backgrounds and were able to kind of take advantage of good testing know-how. And so they took six to 9 months to kind of revise that testing spreadsheet, provide better definitions for those testing criteria, and write out steps to test each of those criteria so that it could be reproduced and so that it could be scored as a pass-fail on each criteria. So it was a more objective way of evaluating a system. And when they rewrote the spreadsheet, they also looked at the trustworthy repositories and audit certification to make sure that these criteria were aligned with that as well. So here's a couple screenshots. I will not subject you to the entire matrix in all its glory, but it is big. So from the second round of system testing, the data sets and the testing were a little bit more objective and made it easier to compare test results across systems. There was a better sense of the requirements that are key, that are kind of a must for digital preservation rather than nice to have. And the time that that the staff took to develop the matrix did take away from actual testing, but the results were higher quality as a result. And that brings us to the third system testing, which began in November of 2016. I joined the State Archives in fall of 2017, and testing was still underway. The library and archives used the matrix developed previously. Since we will be are using the same system but have our separate content and uses of it, we performed our testing separately with the matrix and took notes on our own experiences and questions, and then met to kind of discuss our scoring and our issues. From the archive side, the testing team was me, the systems integration librarian, and our digital services head. In early 2018, LibSafe by LibNova was the third one that we tested, and we moved forward with the recommendation to purchase and justification and beginning pilot project with more of our actual real life data. And that is what we are using now. So here we go. From the third go through of testing, we definitely benefited from having that well-developed testing matrix. There were a few tests in there that were written kind of specifically to the previous system. So as much as we were aiming for a matrix that could be kind of applied across platforms, there's always at least some amount of adaptation needed. Another issue was that the tests didn't always anticipate the issues with real data. Like Suzanne mentioned, trying to break the system, and we did include tests for a lot of the usual problems that we have with our unstructured data that we sometimes get, like long file paths and strange characters and file names and things like that. But there's always a few things that we didn't anticipate. And due to staff turnover, it was kind of a long testing and implementation timeline, a little bit longer, I think, than we would have hoped, but that happens. So finally, just kind of in summary, from the entire process, we kind of learned or would reinforce the importance of having well-documented requirements for your repository that distinguish between required, you must have, versus what would be nice to have functionality. Having clear and well-documented tests and evaluation so that it's not too subjective, to be able to compare different platforms. Knowing your IT and your infrastructure capabilities, obviously that just depends on your situation, but that's part of your requirements as well. And then just kind of, staff turnover is never fun for any of us, but it's kind of a reality, as well as things that you just don't anticipate. There's always those roadblocks or hurdles. So being adaptable and willing to adapt your testing or just documenting whatever you do. So that is what I have. I'm happy to answer questions. Probably email is better than my phone because I'm not in the office very much these days. And I will pass it on to Brian.
Thank you, Jamie. I am using a Bluetooth headset, so if I'm coming off a little weird, someone just let me know that you're getting like surround sound out of sync audio. But I'm going to be talking today about my experience working at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History and selecting an electronic records repository platform. I am familiar with what went on in Texas in the selection and then in the renewal process, but because I was not employed there at the time of the initial thing, it seemed a little weird, whereas in South Carolina, I was there from A to Z. So we're going to start with a little bit of history. In South Carolina was particularly hard hit. I don't know if from a grand perspective, this is harder than other states, but it was very hard hit by the crash in 2008. A lot of state revenue is based on sales tax, and because no one can afford to travel, they had major shortfalls. And the state archives was one of those places that ended up having to shoulder some of that burden. The agency went from a staff of over 100 to a staff of closer to somewhere between 20 and 30, I think. One of those things that happened from the downsizing was that a new director did come in 2009, Eric Emerson, great guy. But in 2014, there was a little kerfuffle with a politician or a part of state government. I think it was the governor's office had an issue with email that really highlighted that although it's going to cost some money, having a digital preservation system is very important to government transparency. So they got some funding, and then they moved forward with establishing a repository. So I was hired in June 2014. After a little bit of time orienting myself to the state, I started testing and looking at what was out there in the field along with Brian Collars. In August 2015, we went forward with the purchase and installation of the repository platform we chose. And although I'm laying this out as a concrete process, this was more of an organic process. So in retrospect, some of this is divided up in the way I'm going to outline. Okay, that did not work like I thought it was. There we go. So the parameters that we were working with within South Carolina, the records needed to actually be held in South Carolina. Ideally, there would be some sort of regional backup or redundancy so that it was separated in geographic zones. South Carolina is a bit of a small state, so it's a little bit harder than some other places, but that was a target. The funding we had was both for hardware and for software. So we were negotiating both of those things. Because of the history of turnover, we were looking for something that would be easy to maintain in case for some reason, I don't know, someone decided to leave just after the installation of the system. Software as a service was definitely a possibility, but on-premise was seen as a better option because it would be within control of the actual archive. And for on-premise, maintenance packages are very common, so that additional expense beyond purchase is something that was considered acceptable. If for some reason, after reviewing the field, it was determined that there was comparable products like apples to apples, we would have to go out for bid. But after investigation, it was determined that this is the system that really does everything we're looking for. Nobody else really does it. Then we could go with the sole source option, which ultimately meant that we were allowed some freedom to do testing and investigation. So the plan evolved into a research and literature review to get a feel for what was out what was out there and what was necessary. Policy writing to really cement out what it is that we needed from the system. Testing and evaluation of the known repository platforms out there. There are a lot of repository platforms, especially back in 2015, 2016. I think it's 2014, 15. It's kind of weeded itself down a little bit, but there's probably things I didn't know of at the time that someone's probably going to raise their hand and say, hey, what about us? You didn't even look at us. But testing and evaluation of what we could, and then making a final recommendation and acquisition. So this next couple slides are more designed for people to be able to browse through at their leisure. What I'm going through is just the literature that I went through with highlights of what we were looking for. So we were looking at the OIS standard documents like CCSDS 652.0, both the M1 and M2, so the classic Magenta book, the Library of Congress track criteria that has been mentioned by both Jamie and Suzanne, and things like reviewing the different metadata standards to both the stuff that's very common in the United States and stuff that's available internationally to get ideas of what kind of metadata a system ideally should have and what we can figure out is the core of what we wanted it to have. You know, maybe a system would have something cool like linked data, which is kind of an ever elusive thing that I think is becoming more and more reality for places, but less so at the time, at least from what I saw. But do we need EAD? Is Dublin Core okay? Qualified Dublin Core conceptually is good, but it's too limited, which is what I would say personally is my opinion. How does METS or premise work in this whole spectrum of metadata and standards? And obviously after that, or in coordination with that, is doing research on just articles of the field, as well as format standards and recommendations. So figuring out, okay, this best practice is to convert Word docs to PDF in our particular context. What systems do that? So identifying what was the best practice and what our take on the best practice was, so we knew what to look for when we were testing the system. And then, of course, the documentation for a repository platform, because they can be very complicated, as we all know. So I think I touched on this a minute before, but we did do policy writing in draft form before we went ahead with testing. The reason that is because it's all good and fine to look at a sports car, but what happens if you really just need a station wagon to get the job done? Sometimes the flashiest thing may not be what's the best fit. So by writing the policies out and mapping out what it is we wanted it to do, we could figure out where things stand in the spectrum of what we needed. I would definitely recommend everybody go through that process. It is very enlightening into what you're actually looking for as opposed to what you think you're looking for. We use the track criteria as kind of a guidance in that. The reason that's so useful is it basically lays it out in bullet points. Really straightforward. This is the sort of thing you're looking for. These are the things you want policies on. And then you can go from there to, I'm going to write a policy on X. I'm going to think this through. What's the workflow going to look like? And also we did draft out metadata requirements based on like transfer forms from state agencies, because South Carolina is a SERI system that relies on things like transfer forms for a lot of data. So going back to the idea of self-assessment, we were looking at what are our current financial resources, what is our future financial resources. We had all experienced not that long ago that just because you have money today doesn't mean you're going to have money tomorrow, and how can we plan to deal with that? What is the staffing going to be? Is this going to be immune to certain staff turnover, or is someone in IT up and quitting 6 months in going to cause like a major hiccup in being able to manage the system? And then finally, the cost of maintenance. So that's tying back to that maintenance package process that some softwares do to keep your system up to date and monitor whether or not it's functioning properly. So this is the long version, or the tiny, tiny version of that particular spreadsheet that ended up coming about from those criteria. Zoom in. So this is the basic, it's not fancy, it's just a basic spreadsheet of ranking saying, okay, from 1 to 5, how does this particular software handle submission? Does it do this? Sometimes it was just a simple matter of checking a box. Sometimes it was like, well, it does it, but it doesn't do it great. So maybe I'll rank that as a 2 as opposed to a 5. Things like, what's the cost? There's a lot of systems like DSpace, for instance, that is technically free, but as someone I know has told me, open source and free is like the same way as a kitten is free. You end up hurting a lot of kittens if you have to know what you're getting yourself into. So what are the costs involved? Administration concerns, are there plugins? There's a lot of the open source and free stuff do have plugins, some of which are third party. Fedora is known for having lots of people do plugins, and that can actually be a detriment if that exponentially increases the amount of technical expertise you need in order to manage the system. What metadata accepts? Does it have a content management system attached to it, or can you attach a content management system to it using like the OAI PMH standard? What is the frequency and use in the field? Because we don't want to get something and then have it go belly up like 6 months later or even 6 years later. If it's frequently adopted, then it's highly likely it'll be out there in a long time. We're not going to get vendor locked or system locked and end up having terabytes of data that are completely inaccessible 10 years from now. And you might notice that I put Linux-based versus Windows-based in this particular spreadsheet, because that can have implications in things like file name length that Suzanne mentioned, or other functionality that may be unique to Windows or maybe unique to Linux. Technically, I think Apple we could say, but I don't know of anything that's actually running on a base of Apple. But there are system limitations based on operating the core operating kernel. So when all was done with that, we came up with 3 tiers, or ended up being 3 tiers. So the tier 3 is not something we were looking for. We didn't, that's a manual preservation tools that are being overall aggregated to equal a repository. We were looking for more like tier 1 or tier 2, where tier 2 is an unintegrated system. Maybe you can have access, but it's mediated, or you have to connect your access system to the preservation system using a plugin. Some or maybe all of the repository services like storage and migration are there. Tier 1 was having fully automated repository services and then integrated access tools. And some of this information in our evaluation is a little dated. For instance, Archivematica has, from what I understand, moved leaps and bounds compared to where they were when I was doing this testing in terms of access or preservation. So that's also something to take into consideration. This is about 5 years old, so the data might be a bit wonky compared to what you see now. But examples of things we tested from tier 2 and tier 1, the digital preservation software platform, Fedora, bane of my existence there. Hydra, could not test because of my issues with Fedora. DSpace, which I had previous experience with, Islandora and Archivist, and Preservica. So the method used to test, and I'll try and power through these last few because I know we're running out of time, was first to, as I referenced before, read the platform documentation to see how it's done, and read up on the documentation of the dependencies if you're installing the system on your own, because sometimes when you're looking at the dependencies, you actually have to look at, okay, these dependencies require these other things, and you go several levels down to make sure you install all of the software necessary to get this thing to work. Once there's a good understanding of how it works, use a virtual machine. I personally love VMware, but VMware costs money. VirtualBox is great. I use VirtualBox every day at my job here, and I used it almost every day when I worked in South Carolina. So installing an operating system from scratch and really following those directions to the letter. A reason I would recommend anybody who's doing testing using virtual machines is because you can screw something up, and all you have to do is delete the virtual machine and you can start over from scratch. If you try to install DSpace from scratch on just a regular Windows machine, you screw something up. The problem is maybe there's something really hidden deep in the registry of the operating system that prevents you from trying again. And I say it that way because that happened to me when I was trying to test DSpace and had to move to, that was my really concrete lesson, to move to virtualization. And then after everything installs properly, going through that checklist of functionality and wish list. And then with the finalists doing side-by-side testing of, okay, does this do this, does this do that? And ultimately, the decision at the end was that Preservica was what we were going to go with as sole source. I've documented the process in an article if anybody wants to take a look and read it. Again, I'm going to emphasize that this was the state of the field at the time based on my knowledge at the time. So if you're going to go about this, don't take my word for it. Go to your local library and kind of look at the field fresh and see if that's going to be what meets your needs, or if something else like Jamie has said they went with LibNova is a better fit. And a quick note about selecting the repository platform in Texas, it went through a little bit of a different process. Same kind of Kickstarter in some ways. Governor Rick Perry decided he was going to run for president, which meant he needed to recuse himself from being governor. He left office in 2015. I guess he didn't have to leave, but he chose to leave. And when he left, he provided funding to establish a repository. In Texas, there is no geographic restrictions like there was in South Carolina. And you could do in-house or software as a service, but the in-house had to go through a state data center, which it was actually quite an expensive prospect. That was a major detriment to being able to do it within the state of Texas data center. So cloud was available, but I did have to get an IT exemption. And it's absolutely required in Texas that you seek bids under what's they call a request for proposal to get official responses. So a little more formal of a checklist of this is what we want. How does your system meet what we want? And based on the responses that they got from the people who submitted their responses, Preservica was the choice that they went with in Texas as well. And that was in 2014 or 2015. And that's all I got. If you want to talk with me about my experience in South Carolina, you'll need to use my personal email address, or better yet, contact Brian Collars of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. If you want to have any questions about how things go in Texas, you can feel free and use my work email or my work phone. There we go. I'm still here, but I think Barbara's communication's a little bit off.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Am I back?
Yep.
All right. Sorry. All right. For the three speakers, we have a question. How involved was IT in your tool review and selection process?
I know for us, I guess IT was somewhat involved in that everything had to be approved for the tools specifically. The preservation system is a different effort in a way. But for the tools, we had to, provide our documentation to IT, and they had to submit an approval before we could download to the VM. So yeah.
Jamie or Brian?
I mean, it was, or I can only speak of it in generally because I wasn't involved in a lot of the conversations with IT, but it was kind of the same where, once they were definitely involved with storage discussions, and we had similar requirements to South Carolina, and that there had to be a local copy. And so, completely cloud storage solutions were off the table, but if it was a hybrid or on-premise, then we worked with IT on that. So yeah, I think things eventually had to be approved before going forward.
So in South Carolina, it's a very informal environment. I'm not going to say that they had like a committee of this or that, but I would go down and talk to our IT staff, which is an IT staff of 1.5 because there was 2 people towards the end of when I was there. So say, hey, can this do this? And what do you think about that?
Okay, thank you. I have a general question. Was it state regulation that made you do an on-premise solution?
Who are you asking?
Any of you? Was it actually regulation, state regulation, that dictated that for you? I'm just curious.
Okay, so for South Carolina, I can say I don't know. I just was talking with my boss and he said, this is what we want. So probably.
Yeah, for us, it was IT, an IT requirement. I guess I should know this. I don't know like what statute that would have been or anything, but it was required to have a copy on premise. I think they're like moving away from that now, so I don't know if they're as strict, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I know that there might be a preference for one or another, but I'm not really overly involved in that. If there's any, mandates to use one or another at this time. So.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming into the chat box.
Barbara, there's one from Bonnie that I think only I can see, so I can read that out.
Oh, Okay.
He has a question for Jamie and Brian. And it's, now that your states have repositories in place, are you thinking of doing another round of assessments and confirming that your current systems are still your best choice?
We are not there yet. We are still, like I mentioned, it's kind of been a long ongoing process. So we're still getting our records into it and kind of figuring out exactly how it fits into our configuration based on the costs. I don't think we're ever gonna, I don't think that we would ever be able to put every record in the same system. And so we'll probably always have some amount of, like our external storage. But we, the exit strategy type of question was a really important one, so that in the future, we know that we could migrate to another system. So yeah, we're not there yet though.
Okay,
That's a good question.
I know we're out of time, but I can't speak for South Carolina because they'd have to steal me back to know that, and for me to be able to answer that. But in Texas, there is a requirement to bid once every, whatever the contract period is. In this case, it's 5 years. So Texas just went through the bidding process again. And so, unless something changes in how things are registered in the Texas system, 5 years from now, or actually like 4 years from now, it'll go out again and we'll see what we see. But we may be vendor locked. Not really, but we have to be honest and say, okay, this is the best system. If we have to move, we have to move.
Okay. Any other questions, Becky?
Nope, that's the only other one I could see.
Okay, great. Well, again, I want to thank our three speakers. They did a remarkable job. Thank you very much. I just want to remind you that when you exit the webinar, there will be a brief survey, and we really appreciate your feedback so that we can plan for future webinars. I want to thank everybody for attending, and make sure you keep track of COSA's future offerings via the website and their Twitter and their Facebook accounts. Once again, thank you everybody for your attention, and have a great afternoon.